In a chaotic 24 hours, in a cold courtroom at the heart of the city, an unyielding woman faces a terrifying nightmare as she's falsely accused of stealing a deadly secret. Will she dismantle the ruthless conspiracy or be forever buried under the blade of fake justice? The Thomas Reed courtroom was shrouded in an oppressive gloom. The flickering lights from old neon bulbs cast intermittent shadows on the scratched gray walls. The smell of old wood and damp paper hung in the air, mingling with the warm breath of those eager to witness a dramatic trial. Above, the ceiling fan spun silently, casting faint shadows on the cold marble floor. Sarah Coleman sat motionless at the defendant's table, her hands tightly clasped together, fingers pale from the force of her grip. No one in this room knew what she was hiding, nor could she predict what would happen next. One thing, however, was certain: she was being hunted. Whispers buzzed from the spectators' bench, unclear whether they were murmurs of discussion or judgment-laden gossip. Some sneered, their eyes sliding over her as if she were nothing more than a broken object. Sarah felt their gaze slither across her skin like invisible knives slicing through her flesh. A middle-aged man dressed in a light gray suit sat cross-legged in a shadowy corner, his eyes quietly studying her as though she were a specimen under a microscope. Sarah didn't recognize him, but an instinct deep inside told her he wasn't here just to observe. Something was being concealed, and she had to uncover it before it was too late. The overhead lights flickered once more, this time more violently, plunging the courtroom into a brief moment of darkness before the cold, sterile light returned. Sarah glanced up, an overwhelming sense of unease filling her chest. This was not a room in search of truth. It was a trap meticulously set, and she was the prey. A police officer standing nearby adjusted his belt, his heavy hand resting on the grip of his gun as a silent reminder that there was no way out. The heavy wooden door at the back of the room swung open, and the sound of boots pounding on the stone floor announced the arrival of a figure of power. Sarah took a deep breath, keeping herself focused. The game had only just begun. Prosecutor Emily Harris moved with calculated precision. Each step on the marble floor echoed through the room like a hammer pounding down a gavel, signifying the inevitable judgment to come. Her high heels clicked sharply against the stone, the sound almost deafening in the otherwise quiet courtroom. Every movement, every gesture seemed deliberate, designed to assert her dominance in this space. The gray blazer she wore hugged her frame perfectly, the sharp lines of her attire matching the cold, calculating demeanor that exuded from her. Her brown eyes, usually warm in most settings, were ice-cold now, radiating a mixture of professional disdain and a sense of superiority that could freeze anyone in place. They flicked over Sarah briefly, the corners of her lips curling into a half-smile, a smile that said she knew exactly how this story would unfold, and she was in complete control. She paused just for a moment before speaking. It wasn't an accidental pause. It was an intentional pause, one meant to heighten the tension in the room, to make everyone hold their breath in anticipation. And it worked. The silence seemed to grow heavier as the air around Sarah thickened, each second dragging on like an eternity. The murmurs of the audience became faint, barely audible, as though the entire room was suspended in time. It was as if Emily Harris knew exactly how to command this moment, how to twist the attention towards her and keep it there just long enough for the storm to break. And then, with the smallest of smirks, she spoke. Sarah Coleman has stolen a deadly secret from Apex Biotech, a despicable act of betrayal. Her words sliced through the silence, so sharp and precise that they cut through the air like the edge of a razor. There was no hesitation in her voice, no flicker of uncertainty. Every syllable was deliberate, each one calculated to inflict the maximum emotional damage. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the venom in her tone, the way she practically spat out the words as if they were beneath her, as though Sarah's very existence was a stain on the courtroom's otherwise pristine record. The power in her voice wasn't just about the law. It was about control, about how easily she could shape the world around her with nothing more than a few well-chosen words. The impact was immediate. A wave of whispered conversation rippled through the courtroom, a mix of disbelief, shock, and judgment. Some in the room nodded in agreement, their faces twisted with contempt, already forming opinions before any evidence had been presented. Others exchanged wary glances, unsure of what to make of the fierce prosecutor's claim. It didn't matter to Emily. The damage was done. She had already framed the narrative, and Sarah was trapped in it. Sarah sat frozen, her body stiff and unmoving, a statue of stoic defiance in the face of an unrelenting storm. Her hands, clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white, were the only sign of the turmoil raging inside her. She had expected this moment, had braced herself for it, but even still, the weight of Emily's words struck her with a force she hadn't anticipated. Each sentence was like a dagger piercing her heart, making her feel the sting of betrayal even though she knew it was all lies. The room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in around her, pressing down on her chest. She could hear the murmurs and whispers, but they felt distant, like they were coming from a different world. The only thing that mattered was the oppressive heat creeping up her neck, the sensation of being exposed, vulnerable. But Sarah refused to let her composure crack. She couldn't afford to let them see how much their words affected her, so she sat perfectly still, not giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing her sweat. Her eyes, sharp and steady, remained fixed on Emily as the prosecutor stood there, basking in the glow of her victory. There was a flicker of disgust, a flash of something almost primal, but Sarah quickly smothered it down. She couldn't afford to let anger or resentment take over, no matter how much she wanted to lash out, to shout that none of this was true. She knew that would only give Emily the upper hand. This wasn't a battle that could be won with emotions. It had to be won with strategy, with precision. She was going to have to outsmart them, outmaneuver them, and not let them drag her down to their level. She breathed deeply, slowly, feeling the cool air fill her lungs as she anchored herself in the present. The courtroom, despite its oppressive atmosphere, began to fade into the background. The whispers, the accusations, Emily's cold gaze, they all blurred into a dull roar as Sarah focused on one thing, one single truth. She had not stolen any secrets. She was not the villain they wanted to make her out to be. And no matter how much they tried to turn the tide against her, she would not be broken. Emily Harris thought she was in control, thought she could dictate the narrative with her words, but Sarah knew better. She knew this game had only just begun. There were more moves to be made, more cards to play, and Sarah was ready. The courtroom might be filled with judgment and lies, but she would be the one to turn it all around. Sarah looked down at her hands, fingers gripping tightly together until her joints turned pale, her nails nearly digging into the flesh. She could feel the rhythm of her heartbeat hammering in her chest, not out of fear, but because a cold, numbing rage was rising within her like a storm quietly swirling at the bottom of the ocean. In front of her, Prosecutor Emily Harris continued to drone on about the charges leveled against her, turning her from a CIA agent into a traitor to the nation. It was a perfectly staged play where Sarah wasn't just trapped in the cage of the justice system, but transformed into a monster in the eyes of the public. Sarah knew the truth. She was not a traitor. She was not a criminal. She was a CIA agent tasked with infiltrating Apex Biotech to investigate the inhumane experiments the company was hiding from the world. The classified report she had gathered had exposed horrific experiments conducted on human bodies, patients used as test subjects, injected with untested compounds, many of whom would never walk out of those lab rooms again. But instead of being recognized for her bravery, she had become the hunted. The lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows across the faces of the jurors. They stared at her, some with suspicion, others with contempt. She could almost hear their thoughts. A black woman tangled up in a high-tech case, going up against a powerhouse corporation like Apex Biotech? A joke. This system had never stood on the side of the vulnerable. Sarah felt as if she was standing in a trial without evidence, without truth, only a story compelling enough for the public to swallow whole. She lifted her head, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. In the far left corner, a group of reporters were snapping photos incessantly, capturing every moment of this trial. They didn't care about justice. They cared about the sensational headlines they'd be printing tomorrow. Double agent steals national secrets. A headline enough to generate millions of clicks. Behind her, several security officers stood silently, their hands casually resting on their belts where their pistols lay. She wasn't the enemy, but they had been trained to see her as a threat. One wrong move, and she could be taken down in an instant. Sarah swallowed hard, the taste of metal filling her mouth. She was surrounded, physically and mentally. They wanted her to feel small, to be afraid, to crumble under this pressure. But she wouldn't let that happen. She had been sold out, betrayed by the very system she had once trusted, but she wouldn't allow herself to be a pawn so easily sacrificed. She looked up, meeting the gaze of Judge Robert Kane. He didn't say a word, but the slight twist of his lips suggested a quiet, knowing contempt, making Sarah feel as though she had already been sentenced before the trial had even begun. A chill ran down her spine. She wasn't just fighting against a power-hungry prosecutor. She was up against a judge who seemed to have already been bought off. Injustice was closing in around her, but Sarah knew she couldn't let them win so easily. She leaned toward her attorney, her voice a quiet whisper, but firm with resolve. "We need to do more, James. We're not just fighting them. We're fighting a system designed to crush me." Her lawyer, James Evans, briefly glanced at her, his expression full of concern but also burning with determination. "I know," he whispered back, "and I won't let that happen." Sarah clenched her fist. They could stage a perfect show against her, but she wouldn't go down without a fight. Not now, not here. The sound of the gavel striking the wooden table rang out with a hollow thud. The sound carried no dignity of justice, but rather the empty display of power. Judge Robert Kane sat on his high platform, the cold light from the overhead lamps accentuating the pale, blotchy lines on his face. His skin was rough, scattered with red patches, as though time and alcohol had ravaged it to its limits. His sagging chin trembled with every breath he took, the soft, flabby tissue shaking with each heavy inhalation. When Kane's eyes scanned over Sarah, she felt a shiver run down her spine. This was not the gaze of someone administering justice, but the look of a man accustomed to judgment, driven by greed and self-interest. Sarah held her breath, fighting to suppress the disgust rising in her stomach. He wasn't looking at her as a defendant. He saw her as prey caught in a trap, waiting for the moment when she would be torn apart piece by piece. Kane's lips twitched, a twisted smile appearing like a crack in a crumbling wall. "Let's begin the trial," he rasped, his thick lips curling unpleasantly. His voice carried a greasy quality, as if each word he spoke was coated with the dirt and oil of corruption. Sarah wondered if anyone else in the room could see through the sheer falseness of it all, or if they all simply turned a blind eye, accepting him as just another part of the decaying system. The air in the courtroom was thick and suffocating, so dense that Sarah felt as though she was breathing in a room with no oxygen. The heat from the bodies of dozens of people in the room mingled together, but instead of warmth, it only created a stifling, oppressive atmosphere. She could hear the rustling of Emily Harris's suit as the prosecutor leaned forward, preparing to unleash the next blow, to push Sarah further down. Sarah lowered her gaze, focusing on her breath, trying to keep her mind clear. This was no longer just a trial. It was a hunt, and Judge Kane, with his scaly face, was the one tipping the scales heavily in favor of one side. A tense silence hung in the air before Kane spoke again, his tongue moving sluggishly, as though each word had been carefully calculated to suit the puppet master pulling the strings from behind. "We will clarify the charges against the defendant," he said, his heavy hand slamming down on the pile of files before him. Sarah glanced briefly at the stack of papers, knowing they were filled with distorted information, fabricated evidence, and charges painted by those who wanted her gone. She didn't need to hear more to understand that this trial was not about seeking truth. It was nothing more than a performance, a play in which she was forced to play the villain. And Robert Kane, with his alcohol-red face and skin covered in flakes, was the director pulling the strings. The air in the courtroom was thick and oppressive, clinging to Sarah's skin like a layer of grime, making every breath feel like an effort. She sat motionless, her chest rising and falling with each heartbeat, as Judge Kane, with his red face resembling that of a man who had just emptied a bottle of liquor, slammed the gavel down onto the table. "Counselor Evans, stop wasting time with these fabricated stories," he roared, his voice reverberating across the room, crushing any attempt at resistance. All eyes turned to James Evans, Sarah's lawyer, who had tried to present a reasonable argument but was shut down the moment he opened his mouth. Kane would not allow any defense to be voiced completely, and everyone in the room understood that. James tightened his grip on the file in his hands, holding back the rising frustration. "Your Honor, I am presenting real evidence, documents proving that." "Enough," Kane interrupted, his bony hand with the red, scaly patches raised as if ready to strike again, sealing off any truth. "This court is not a place for baseless arguments. We are trying a traitor to the nation, not listening to a play staged by her attorney." His words were heavy, like stones being dropped one after another, crushing every last hope in the space. Sarah clenched her teeth, her hands hidden under the table, gripping so tightly that her joints turned pale. She had seen lies, faced deceitful figures in the underground world, but never had she encountered such blatant filth as what was unfolding in this courtroom. Kane was no longer pretending to be neutral. He was openly distorting the truth like a butcher wielding a cleaver, tearing apart a still-breathing animal. And the audience, the jurors, the reporters, all watching, they either stood by or, worse, believed in the judgment of a man rotted to the core. Outside the window, the sky was ominous, with dark clouds swirling like a storm taking shape, mirroring the suffocating atmosphere inside. The neon lights overhead flickered, casting shadows on Kane's face, making him appear like a two-faced character straight out of a horror movie. Sarah looked at him, her contempt clear in her gaze. She knew that Kane didn't truly hold the power to decide this outcome. There was a hand in the shadows that had scripted this entire play, and Kane was merely the puppet carrying out orders. But the issue wasn't that he was being manipulated. The problem was that he wasn't even trying to resist. The rustling from the press bench grew louder as some reporters leaned forward to jot down notes, while others sat back silent, as if considering whether this case was worth digging deeper into. Sarah felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. No one here truly cared about justice. To them, she was just a name in a sensational headline, a photo on the front page with a catchy caption. She clenched her fists. If they thought she would surrender, they were sorely mistaken. James Evans let out a slow breath, his eyes briefly flashing with weariness but still resolute. He slowly placed his hand on the table, his voice lowered but firm enough to command attention. "Your Honor," he said, each word emphasized as if carving a warning into the cold walls of this courtroom. "If the truth cannot be spoken here, then this is no longer a trial. This is an execution." The room fell into complete silence. Kane opened his mouth, but no words came immediately. In that brief moment, though fleeting, he realized that not everyone could be controlled. And Sarah, despite sitting in the defendant's chair, also realized that she was not alone. Sarah looked at James, seeing the tension etched on every line of his face. His eyes reflected a sense of helplessness, not because he didn't want to fight, but because he couldn't fight in a game that had already been rigged from the start. She saw his jaw clench, his fingers instinctively digging into the edge of the wooden table as if trying to hold on to any shred of justice left in this trial. But like her, he knew that every effort now was as futile as punching the air. Kane had decided the outcome long before the trial had even begun. There was no chance for her. She wanted to scream. She wanted to pound the table, point directly at Kane, and expose this farce to everyone in the room. She wanted to tell all the people sitting in this courtroom that they weren't watching a fair trial, but rather witnessing a cheap play staged by the powerful. But she couldn't. All she could do was sit still, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails nearly dug into her palms. The anger swelled inside her like a boiling lava flow, but she had to hold it back, had to swallow it down, maintaining the calm exterior she had learned to perfect after years of dangerous assignments. Kane's gaze swept over her once again, a look of satisfaction on his face, as if he were savoring every second of her helplessness, knowing she could do nothing but sit there powerless in this unjust judgment. She felt as though she were sinking into a sea of black water, where each breath was being drained away by an invisible hand. There was a deep wound within her, bleeding not from fear but from disgust. Disgusted with the system, disgust with men like Kane, and disgust with herself for letting herself be caught in this trap. The sound of the gavel brought her back to reality. Kane raised an eyebrow, then smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. "Continue, if you still want to waste more time," he sneered. His voice was thick and oily, each word dripping with unmasked contempt. Sarah's stomach tightened. Everything in this room was pressing down on her, the air thick with falseness, with lies spoken so smoothly, as if they were truth. She glanced at James again, seeing him nod slightly, a reminder that they hadn't lost yet. But in this moment, she only felt one truth more clearly than ever before. This was not a trial seeking justice. This was a hunt, and she was the prey, cornered, waiting for the final blow. Emily Harris stepped forward, her sharp high heels echoing loudly against the cold marble floor. She slowly placed a thick stack of files onto the evidence table, then shot a victorious glance at the jury. "Your Honor," she said, her voice dripping with dramatic flair like a seasoned actress on stage. "This is irrefutable evidence of the defendant Sarah Coleman's motive." A staff member quickly scurried through the rows of seats, distributing copies of the documents to the jury. "An offshore bank account." Emily emphasized each word, drawing out the tense silence before delivering the final blow, containing millions of dollars under the name of Sarah Coleman. The courtroom seemed to shudder. Some jurors furrowed their brows. Others exchanged cautious glances, while the audience murmured with excitement. Emily crossed her arms and smirked as if she had just checkmated her opponent in a game she had already won. "This is the motive, greed," she concluded, punctuating the statement with a mocking grin, her white teeth gleaming like a predator about to sink its teeth into its prey. Sarah felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. She had braced herself for the fabrications, but this, an offshore bank account under her name holding an enormous sum of money, was a blow she hadn't seen coming. Her hands clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her skin, desperately trying to control the rage that was boiling inside her veins. This wasn't just an accusation. It was a blatant distortion, an attempt to turn her into a money-hungry traitor in the eyes of everyone watching this trial. She glanced at James, seeing his face pale, his eyes quickly scanning the pile of documents, searching for a crack, a way to counter the evidence. But Sarah knew the people behind this couldn't have left a mistake. This was a perfect trap, one crafted by powerful hands, people with enough influence to create irrefutable fake evidence. She wasn't just being framed. She was being destroyed in the most meticulous way possible. Judge Kane cleared his throat, his eyes lighting up with satisfaction as he looked through the papers. "It seems we found the truth, haven't we, Counselor Evans?" His voice was heavy but laced with a cruel sense of gratification. Sarah could see it in his eyes. He didn't care whether the evidence was real or not. He just needed a reason to crush her, and now that reason was placed right before him. James shot up from his seat, the chair scraping loudly against the marble floor, sending a jarring echo through the courtroom. "Your Honor," he shouted, his eyes blazing with fury, his hand gripping the pile of documents handed to him, as if squeezing harder could turn them into dust. "We were never informed of this evidence. This is a filthy trick, a blatant violation of due process." His voice was full of rage, each word carrying the weight of someone cornered, yet still fighting back. Sarah felt his anger, but she also felt her own, like a tidal wave ready to break loose. The surge of emotion was overwhelming, itching to explode and tear down every wall in her path. But Kane simply shook his head, his eyes cloudy like two cold stones beneath the flickering lights. His lips were pressed tight, strained, as if chewing something rotten, savoring the moment with a sick, perverse pleasure. "Counselor Evans." His voice was low and almost lazy, as if used to crushing those who dared challenge his power. "If you cannot control your emotions, I will be forced to treat this as a disruption." A short statement, but one laced with a clear threat. He didn't care about fairness, about truth. He only wanted to finish this game the way he and his puppeteers had planned. Sarah felt her stomach twist, the nausea rising in her throat. She was disgusted, not just by the injustice unfolding before her eyes, but by its unabashed audacity. There was no effort to maintain the illusion of a fair trial, no hint of reconsideration or scrutiny. Everything had been decided long ago, and she was merely a puppet being dragged across this stage, only to be discarded as useless debris when it was over. James clenched his fists, taking a deep breath to hold back the rage building inside him. "I request a review of the authenticity of this account," he said, his voice lower yet still firm. "We have the right to investigate the origin of this newly surfaced evidence before proceeding with the trial." But Kane only sneered, a twisted smile on his lips, his head tilting as he glanced over at Sarah, as if she were a mere insect trapped in his web. "Request denied," he said, striking the gavel down. The sound was sharp and final, like a verdict without a trial. "We continue." Sarah shut her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of despair creep into every inch of her being, like a thick black smoke tightening around her from the inside. They didn't just want to convict her. They wanted her to fall, wanted her to feel cornered with no way out. But she couldn't let that happen. Not now, not here. Sarah lowered her head, struggling to regulate her breath, but in her chest, Her heartbeat pounded like the drumbeat of an impending disaster. Her mind felt dizzy, everything in the courtroom twisting, the voices around her blending into a chaotic symphony. Whether they were voices of people or echoes from an endless nightmare, she couldn't tell. She needed to focus. She needed to keep her composure. But this trap was too perfect, every link in the chain meticulously placed to drag her down without giving her a chance to resist. The smell of old wood from the judge's bench, the musty scent of paper, the cheap perfume of someone sitting close by, everything mixed together into a heavy stench that made her stomach tighten. But what disgusted her most wasn't the smell around her. It was the sense of decay that radiated from every corner of the room. It was the smell of betrayal, of those who had sold her out, of the invisible hands that had manipulated everything to corner her. She could feel it clearly. The ones behind this trial didn't just want to convict her. They wanted to destroy her, to crush every last bit of dignity and honor she had left so that no one would ever believe her again. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her hands from trembling. The questions churned in her mind like sharp, cold knives. Who had masterminded this entire plan? Who had the power to manipulate the entire judicial system, to create fake evidence so flawless that even James couldn't immediately refute it? And most importantly, who had betrayed her? Her hand clenched into a fist, her nails digging into her palm, but she didn't feel the pain. The rage inside her had surpassed physical sensation, swirling in her mind like a violent storm. She wanted to leap out of the chair, overturn everything, and point at Judge Kane's face, screaming that he was nothing but a puppet for those pulling the strings, that he had sold his soul for a decaying power. But she couldn't. She glanced at James, seeing him clench his teeth, but his eyes still held a faint glimmer of hope. He hadn't given up, and neither could she. Even as her mind spun, even as the disgust tightened around her like an invisible noose, she had to stand firm. They could twist the truth, they could distort her image, but they couldn't take the most important thing from her, her will. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, took a deep breath, then opened them, no longer trembling. Her eyes gleamed coldly like steel freshly sharpened. If this was a chess game, then she still had moves no one could predict. She wouldn't be consumed by this nightmare. Not ever. Sarah walked out of the courtroom like a soulless shell, her footsteps heavier than ever before. The entire trial had been a filthy charade, and she had been cast as the villain with no chance to defend herself. No one cared about the truth. No one cared that the fabricated evidence might have been orchestrated by some powerful force. They just wanted a name to blame, and she had been chosen. James walked beside her, his face taut with tension, but he didn't say a word. They both knew that any movement, any word could be twisted against them. The taxi stopped in front of an old building on the outskirts of the city. Sarah stepped into the shabby apartment she had rented to lie low during the investigation. The walls were peeling, the dim lights flickered, casting shadows over the scratched surface of the wooden table. She quickly checked the security system before pulling out a small laptop from her bag, opening it, and connecting to a CIA encrypted channel. The screen flickered for a few seconds, then a face appeared, David Brooks, her direct supervisor on this mission. Brooks's face looked more gaunt than usual, his deep-set eyes showing signs of extreme stress. Sarah, his voice was low with a slight tremor, something she had never heard from him before. We've hit a problem. Your mission files have been locked. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. What do you mean? She asked. But even as the words left her mouth, she already knew the answer. Brooks took a deep breath, as if he too didn't want to believe what he was about to say. We can't access any files related to your mission at Apex Biotech. The system has frozen everything. No one on the internal intelligence team can get into it. We're being silenced, Sarah. Someone is controlling the entire situation from above. A cold wave of realization washed over Sarah, sending a chill down her spine. She had suspected that a powerful hand was behind the trap set for her, but she hadn't anticipated that even the CIA would be compromised. If the agency she had once served, trusted, could so easily turn its back on her, then she was truly alone. Her vision darkened, disgust welling up from deep within her chest. She had sacrificed so many years of her life, put herself in countless dangerous situations to protect the system, to carry out the missions they had entrusted her with. Yet when she became the expendable pawn, they were ready to erase her from existence as though she had never been there. So what's plan B? She asked, her voice icy. Brooks hesitated. We're trying to figure it out, but Sarah, listen. He paused, glancing to the side as if afraid someone was watching. If we can't unlock your files in the next few days, they'll have full control over your fate. And when that happens, he stopped, but Sarah understood. And when that happens, she would be buried forever. She clenched her fist. If the system had turned its back on her, then she would have to save herself. Sarah stared at the screen where David Brooks's tense face appeared under the pale blue light of the encrypted system. "We're trying to figure it out," he repeated, but his eyes averted, unwilling to meet hers. A simmering anger began to rise in Sarah's chest, hot as a flame ready to ignite. She was too familiar with this tone. The delays, the empty promises, the way those in power always dragged their feet, covering up the truth that they had abandoned her. She scoffed, a bitter, disdainful laugh escaping her lips. "Trying to figure it out? Or are you just waiting for everything to blow over and for me to disappear forever?" Her voice wasn't loud, but there was a weight to it that made Brooks swallow hard. She could see the confusion in his eyes, the way he clenched his jaw as if struggling between his conscience and the orders from above. But no matter how much he hesitated, the truth was already crystal clear. They didn't intend to save her. Sarah leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if it was the only thing keeping her from sinking into a pit of despair. "They've locked all the files about my mission, silenced anyone who dares speak up." "What does that mean, Brooks?" "It means I've been sold out, thrown away, erased from the list of those worthy of protection." She emphasized each word, her eyes blazing with a fury that was almost frightening. Brooks closed his eyes briefly, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, the confusion had gone, replaced by a quiet exhaustion. "Sarah, I don't have an answer, but I know one thing. You cannot make yourself visible. You cannot draw any more attention. They're watching you." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Me? I can't make myself visible? I've been dragged into a courtroom, turned into a monster in front of the public. I've been exposed in a way no one can walk away from pretending they didn't see what happened. And now you tell me to stay quiet, to wait while you figure it out? While every second that passes, they're tightening the noose around my neck." David didn't respond immediately. He knew he couldn't defend the system any longer. He also knew that the promises were only making Sarah hate everything she had once trusted. She was no longer their agent. She was a woman being hunted, abandoned in a maze of powerful figures pulling the strings from the shadows. Sarah closed her eyes for a second, taking a deep breath, and then opened them. When she looked back at the screen, her voice no longer trembled with anger or despair. It was cold, like chilled steel. "I don't believe in promises anymore, Brooks. I'll take care of myself." With that, she disconnected the call, leaving a blank screen and an eerie silence that filled the room. The screen went black, leaving behind a shadow that reflected Sarah's face, cold, tense, and full of rage. She sat still for a moment, her fist clenched, feeling the rapid thrum of her heartbeat, the anger unlike anything she had ever experienced. Then, like the final spark igniting in a barrel of oil, she jumped up, slamming her fist down on the old wooden table. The sound was sharp, searing, but it paled in comparison to the pain that churned in her chest. She couldn't rely on anyone anymore. She had looked to the CIA, to the government, to the people who once promised to protect her, but all of them had turned their backs. She had hoped someone would reach out to pull her from this mire, but the truth was, no one would. She was alone. Not only had they abandoned her, they wanted her to disappear. But if they thought she would fall, if they thought she would accept the fate of a discarded pawn, then they had made a fatal mistake. The disgust at this betrayal didn't weaken her. It didn't shatter her. On the contrary, it ignited a fire inside her, a fire of survival, of determination to make them pay for everything they had done to her. She had spent her life serving a system she believed was just, but now she realized that justice didn't come from towering buildings or seals on documents. Justice could only be claimed when she took it herself. She took a deep breath, feeling the pulse of her veins racing through her body, every muscle taut with fury. She was no longer afraid. No more hesitation. No more trust in anyone but herself. She would find the truth. She would overturn the board they had set up to crush her. And when that happened, the betrayers would pay. Sarah stood up, her eyes flashing with cold resolve. She knew she didn't have much time, but she still had the strongest weapon, an unbreakable will. And with that, she would not lose. The next day's trial unfolded in an atmosphere thick with tension. Sarah sat motionless, her eyes as cold as blades hidden in the shadows. She didn't take her gaze off James, who stood up, inhaling deeply before speaking. Your Honor, we request that a special witness be called, David Brooks. The mention of his name made the courtroom fall into an eerie silence. Some reporters quickly scribbled down notes. The jurors exchanged curious glances, while Emily Harris, sitting with her legs crossed nonchalantly, tilted her head with a faint, amused smile. The door at the back creaked open, and David Brooks entered, his suit slightly wrinkled, his face gaunt, but his eyes steady. He walked slowly to the witness stand, each step seeming to echo with an invisible weight on the marble floor. Sarah watched him, but this time she didn't expect anything. He had once been her supervisor, the person she trusted, but after last night's call, she knew he too was just another pawn in the system. David took his seat, scanning the courtroom briefly before speaking in a low but firm voice. Sarah is not a traitor. She is an intelligence agent sent to investigate Apex Biotech for their illegal activity. The room seemed to hold its breath. Sarah didn't move, but inside, every nerve in her body was tense. Those words, those truths she had known all along but no one had dared to speak, were finally said out loud in this courtroom. But then a sound cut through the air, a quiet laugh, gentle like a blade brushing against skin. Emily Harris smirked, her eyes glinting with an unmasked disdain. She leaned forward, resting her elbow on the table as if enjoying a performance more than a trial. A nice story, she said, her voice slow and almost soothing, but every word laced with mockery. But I'm afraid there's no evidence to back up Mr. Brooks's testimony, is there? Sarah felt her stomach twist. She was disgusted by the smugness, the way Emily looked at her as if she were already defeated, as if everything she had done, everything she had sacrificed, was for nothing. She knew that even when the truth was spoken, it didn't mean justice would prevail, not in a system this rotten to the core. Judge Kane frowned, tapping his gavel lightly. Prosecutor Harris, do you have any questions for the witness? Emily leaned back in her chair, her smile still dripping with contempt. Oh, I do, she said, her voice smooth like silk but full of sharp edges. She turned to David, her gaze sharp as a knife reflecting cold light. Tell me, Mr. Brooks, if Sarah is truly the agent investigating Apex Biotech, then why is there no official documentation to confirm that? No files, no work orders, no trace in the system? Why is that? David paused for a moment, and Sarah knew just that 1 second was enough to destroy all hope. Because her files had been erased. Because she had been erased. And right now, Emily Harris knew she had the victory in her hands. The sound of Kane's gavel slamming down onto the table echoed through the suffocating silence of the courtroom. These words hold no legal value, he bellowed, his voice hoarse like an animal cornered, desperately trying to protect its territory. The tension in the air was thick enough to feel. The jurors' gazes wavered, some confused, others revealing suspicion, but it didn't matter. Kane had made up his mind long ago, and he wouldn't allow anyone to destroy it. Sarah watched him, a surge of disgust rising in her chest. The way he clung to his dirty power like a blood-sucking leech, refusing to let go even as the truth was glaringly clear, made her want to vomit. His eyes bulged, the patches of red skin on his face swelling with anger. He no longer pretended to be neutral. Now Kane revealed his true face. A servant of the dark powers pulling the strings, a man willing to smother justice just to protect his own position. James Evans sprang to his feet, slamming his hands on the table. Your Honor, you can't dismiss the testimony of a CIA agent with a baseless claim. This is no longer a fair trial. It's a staged farce. His voice was sharp, cutting through the heavy atmosphere. But Kane only sneered, his eyes radiating deep contempt. I'm the judge here, Counselor Evans, and I decide what is of value and what is not. Kane emphasized each word, a reminder of his power in a room that was quickly slipping out of his control. If you have no concrete evidence, I will not allow baseless accusations to continue disrupting this trial. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure, but she knew she couldn't sit idly by as the truth was twisted further. She leaned toward James, her voice low but cold as steel. They're pushing us into a corner. If we don't make a decisive move now, I won't have any chance left. James hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He knew she was right. The game was coming to an end, and if they didn't act now, Sarah would be crushed under the wheels of this fake justice. Kane glanced at his watch before turning to Prosecutor Emily Harris. Prosecutor Harris, do you need any more witnesses, or can we proceed to the final judgment? His voice was full of expectation, a yearning for a guaranteed victory, a sentence already written before the trial even began. Sarah locked eyes with him, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails nearly dug into her skin. She didn't know if she could change anything, but she knew one thing. She would not leave this trial as a defeated soul. If this was the end, then at least she would make them tremble. Whispers began to spread like an undercurrent, creeping through the courtroom from the jurors' bench to the spectator area. At first, they were scattered murmurs, but soon they grew louder, merging into a frightening buzz. Sarah didn't need to hear every word to know what they were discussing. The looks that flashed her way, cold, suspicious, even contemptuous, spoke volumes. She could feel the atmosphere shift with every breath she took. It was no longer mere curiosity. It was a thirst to see her fall. These people hadn't come to seek the truth or justice. They were here for a sensational story, for the twisted pleasure of watching someone dragged to the edge and pushed into the abyss. They were outsiders, yet they reveled in the misery of another. Sarah took a deep breath, but she couldn't shake the rising disgust. It felt like standing in the midst of vultures, hungry predators waiting for the moment she broke completely, ready to tear her apart. They didn't care about the truth. They just needed a name to condemn, a face to hate, a villain to turn into their target. And today, she was playing that part. She glanced at Kane, seeing the old judge lean back in his chair, his expression calm, as if he were too familiar with this scene. Another victim, another farce, another act in the play he had been running for years. And Emily Harris, arms crossed, lips curled into a mocking smile, seemed to savor every moment of this trial. Sarah didn't turn her head, but she knew James felt it too. He took a quiet breath, his hand tightening around the file, as if he wanted to crush it. "We're losing control," he whispered, just low enough for her to hear. Sarah didn't respond. She had known that for a long time. And if they didn't act now, if they didn't do something to break the game their enemies had set, she wouldn't just lose this case, she would lose everything. The final day of the trial unfolded under an atmosphere so tense that no one dared to even breathe loudly. The harsh lights, the crowded seats filled with people, and the excitement mixed with curiosity from the crowd were like invisible blades cutting through the air, waiting for the final moment to judge Sarah's fate. She sat still, her back straight, eyes calm, but deep inside, a violent storm was brewing, ready to explode. She had reached the very end of this game, and now only one final move remained. The courtroom door swung open. All eyes immediately turned toward the entrance, where David Brooks stepped in, holding a thick stack of documents sealed with the bright red CIA stamp. No one needed to speak to understand that this was the moment that would change everything. David didn't look at Sarah, but she could see the determination on his face. This time, he could not remain silent. James stood up, his voice strong, resonating through the room. "Your Honor, we have crucial evidence to present." He glanced at Judge Kane, whose face was already twisted in displeasure. "This document was taken directly from the CIA's secure system. It will prove that Sarah Coleman is not only innocent, but also the victim of a much more dangerous conspiracy." The room fell into a terrifying silence. The whispers stopped. The eyes of the jurors narrowed with suspicion, and even the breath of the onlookers was held in anticipation. Emily Harris stiffened, her teeth clenched, but she didn't speak immediately. She was calculating her next move, trying to find a crack in the armor, but she knew there was no escape this time. David opened the folder, quickly flipping through a few pages, then raised a document high. "This file," he said, holding up a sheet filled with official seals and signatures, "is the approved mission of the CIA assigning Agent Sarah Coleman to investigate Apex Biotech's illegal activities. All the charges against her are based on fabricated evidence created to cover up the truth." His words exploded like a bomb in the courtroom. Several jurors widened their eyes, reporters in the back rows quickly scribbled down notes, and camera flashes flickered nonstop, trying to capture this moment. Emily Harris went pale. The self-assurance that usually clung to her face was gone, replaced by a look of confusion and anger. She turned to Kane, but this time the judge couldn't keep his calm demeanor either. His face twisted like a worm exposed to the sun, his dry lips tightly pressed, eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. But there was no escape. Sarah watched all of them. Emily, Cain, those who had once looked down on her, those who believed they could crush her without anyone noticing. And now, when the truth was revealed, they were the ones who trembled. A cold smile flickered across her lips. It wasn't from joy but from the disgust that rose within her. They had staged a fake show to destroy her, and now they were being exposed in the light, revealed for what they truly were, liars, rotten to the core. Cain swallowed hard and quickly slammed his gavel down, his voice trembling. The court will adjourn to review the new documents. But no one was listening to him anymore. The game was over, and this time, Sarah was the victor. The courtroom fell into a deathly silence as the jury returned after deliberations. Every gaze turned to them, holding their breath, waiting for the final verdict. Sarah sat still, her hands intertwined, but not out of worry or anxiety. She had no more feeling left. The process had worn everything away inside her, leaving her so hardened that she no longer expected any fairness from this system. A middle-aged woman, the jury forewoman, stood up. She scanned the room, took a deep breath, then spoke. We, the jury, after reviewing all the evidence and testimony, find the defendant, Sarah Coleman, not guilty. The words rang out like the toll of a bell, the verdict that many had been waiting for. But Sarah didn't feel relief. No joy. No victory. Behind her, some whispers rose, quickly drowned out by the noise of reporters. They rushed to each other, scribbling notes, snapping photos, sending out breaking news. Former CIA agent acquitted. One of the most controversial trials in history ends with a big surprise. But to Sarah, none of this was surprising. She had known the truth all along. She was never guilty. James sighed with relief beside her and turned to smile. We did it, he said. But Sarah only looked at him with hollow eyes. Did they? Had they won? She wasn't sure anymore. She glanced at Judge Cain, his face still cold but now paler than before. He slammed his gavel down, trying to maintain some semblance of authority. The trial is concluded, he announced, but no one was listening anymore. Sarah stood, stepping away from the defendant's seat, but she didn't feel freedom. All she felt was disgust. Disgusted with the system that had thrown her into hell in the first place. A system that could easily crush a person with a few fabricated pieces of evidence. One that manipulated justice to serve the whims of those in the shadows. Today she had been freed, but how many others were still trapped in this invisible machine? The crowd parted as she walked through, but their gazes still weighed heavily on her. Some curious, some disappointed at not getting a more sensational ending. Others looking at her like a rare phenomenon. A person swallowed by the system, but walking out alive. But she no longer cared. She took a deep breath as she exited the courtroom, not out of joy, but because she needed to breathe an air that wasn't tainted by dirty trials, fake people, and political games disguised as justice. But she knew that was impossible. She had escaped, but she would never forget what they had done to her. And if this system could be manipulated to turn against her once, it would surely target others. She was no longer their agent, but she would not be silent. Never again. Sarah stepped out of the courthouse. The cold air outside was sharper than she had expected. The sky was overcast, the thick clouds hanging heavily as if they could crush the entire city. But it wasn't the weather that made her stop. It was the scene before her. A group of federal agents stormed the building, guns at their belts, eyes cold with intent. Robert Cain, who had just finished the trial with his smug face, was now surrounded by black-suited agents, weapons hidden under their coats. A scream rose from the crowd. Robert Cain arrested for corruption. A reporter rushed forward, raising a camera, capturing the moment as the man who had once sat on the judge's throne was now being pulled down from his seat of power. Sarah stood still, watching him jerk his head in shock as he turned toward the police, his face, usually so filled with authority, now as pale as paper. What? What is this? Cain stammered, but no one answered. A pair of cold handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists, and for the first time, he was no longer the one holding the power to judge anyone. The police pushed him down, twisting his arms behind him, dragging him through the hallway while the murmurs of the crowd echoed around them. He struggled, but no one cared. The reporters shoved their way through, snapping photos nonstop, microphones thrusting toward his face. Judge Cain, do you plead guilty? Who did you take bribes from? How many cases did you manipulate? He didn't respond. His eyes were blank, his face drained of all life. The confident posture he had held as he mercilessly crushed Sarah was now gone, replaced with the trembling figure of a hunted animal. Sarah watched him, but there was no sense of satisfaction. All she felt was disgust, disgust at the way people like him had once believed themselves untouchable, manipulating justice to serve the hidden forces, only to be exposed as nothing more than discarded puppets. A police officer shoved Kane into a car, slamming the door shut. He didn't scream, didn't beg, no longer had the authority to give orders. Amidst the flashing camera flashes and the endless chatter of the crowd, Sarah turned away, her eyes cold as ice. Kane had fallen, but the battle wasn't over because she knew there were more like him, and she wouldn't let them escape. Sarah sat alone in the small cafe, the soft yellow light reflecting off the worn wooden table. She gently stirred her cup of coffee, but didn't drink it. Her mind still lingered on the image of Robert Kane being dragged away in handcuffs, his face contorted in despair. But the fall of a man like him didn't bring her any relief. The doorbell jingled. David Brooks stepped in, his suit sharp, but his eyes showing signs of weariness. He scanned the cafe quickly before heading to her table. No pleasantries were exchanged, and Sarah only looked at him with a cold, piercing gaze as he pulled the chair out and sat down across from her. David placed an envelope on the table, sliding it toward her. "The CIA wants you to come back," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a hint of hesitation. "They're offering a new position, training new agents." Sarah sat in silence for a moment, then let out a low, humorless laugh. She looked directly at David, then at the envelope in front of her, as if it were the most absurd joke she'd ever heard. "They want me to train new agents?" she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "After everything that's happened? After they let me be hunted, betrayed, crushed by the very system I protected?" David didn't answer. He just silently looked at her. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with contempt. "You know what disgusts me the most, David? It's not how they tried to deny me when everything began. It's how they come back now that I've survived, pretending nothing ever happened, as if they owe me no explanation, no apology, just simply an invitation." David sighed, rubbing his temples. "Sarah, I understand you're angry, but no, you don't understand," Sarah interrupted. "You're not the one who was discarded by this system, not the one who was hunted down like a traitor for simply doing my job. I've seen the truth about the system we served, David, and I'm not sure I want to protect it anymore." David fell silent, then pushed the envelope closer to her. "At least think about it." Sarah looked down at the envelope but didn't touch it. She had once believed in the CIA, once entrusted her life to them, but now, to her, it was nothing but ashes, a part of her past she wasn't sure she wanted to return to. She looked up, her gaze cold as ice. "I'll think about it." But both of them knew the answer was already clear. Sarah stood up, the wooden chair creaking under her weight. Without looking back, she knew David was still watching, waiting for an answer, for a hint of hesitation. But she had nothing left to say. She had made her decision the moment she saw the envelope on the table. She walked out of the cafe, the door closing softly behind her, leaving David sitting there alone with words that had never been spoken. There was nothing to regret, nothing to hold on to. The afternoon air was chilly, the wind sweeping through the crowded streets, but Sarah didn't feel it. She had once dreamed of standing here, outside the invisible prison of an unjust trial, breathing the air as a free person. But now she realized that freedom wasn't just about escaping a sentence. It was a choice, a path. She had survived, but she was no longer whole. The disgust for the lies, corruption, and betrayal had etched itself deep into her soul like an indelible scar. She had witnessed those who once stood at the pinnacle of power fall, but she had also seen the very system she had once trusted try to erase her existence. She would not go back. Never again. Her steps were firmer as she blended into the crowd on the street. She didn't know where she was going, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't matter. Now she chose freedom, not for forgiveness, but so she would never again become a part of that decaying system. In life, sometimes we face injustice, betrayal, and challenges that seem insurmountable. But those moments are not the end. They are tests to see how strong we can be. Sarah chose her own path, not because she wanted to run away, but because she understood that sometimes letting go of a decaying system is the only way to truly find oneself again. Thank you for following this story until the very end. This journey is not just Sarah's, but a reminder that in life, we will face challenges, betrayals, and adversities that seem impossible to overcome. But no matter what, never let anyone or any system define your worth. Strength doesn't come from never falling, but from knowing how to stand up and keep moving forward on your own terms. If you enjoy emotional stories and deep life lessons, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the latest content from Emotional Journey. Leave a comment with your thoughts, as every piece of feedback is what drives us to bring you even more meaningful stories. Once again, thank you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you in the next story.